Welcome to the 2014 Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare Learning Module titled Understanding the Resettlement Context, Vulnerabilities and Resettlement Supports for Refugee Families. Participants who complete this learning module will be able to describe common traumatic experiences of refugees and their effects on mental health and resettlement outcomes, describe resettlement stressors that may impact the well-being and functioning of refugee families, describe physical, psychological, and social barriers to family health for refugees in resettlement, and describe the potential resource needs of vulnerable refugee families and identify resources to meet these needs. This module has 6 parts, which are listed here. The term refugee is a legal immigration status that is defined in U.S. law. Refugees are people who have been persecuted or have a well-founded fear of persecution in their home country based on 5 factors: their race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. The U.S. Refugee Program, which was established by the Refugee Act of 1980, provides a number of pre- and post-arrival services to refugees who are admitted to the United States. Part 2. Who are Minnesota's refugee populations? This slide gives you an idea of the largest refugee groups to have resettled to Minnesota over a 10-year period between 2002 and 2012. These numbers are primary arrivals, or refugees who have been resettled directly to Minnesota from overseas. This map shows the distribution of primary refugees who resettled to Minnesota in the year 2012 by county. You can see that Hennepin and Ramsey have the highest concentrations of new arrivals, followed by Stearns, Olmsted, and Anoka. These graphs are for the 4 counties with the largest numbers of refugee arrivals in 2012. Each graph shows the distribution of refugees by country of origin who resettled to each county. You can see that refugees from Burma were the largest group to resettle in Ramsey County in 2012, and refugees from Somalia were the largest group to resettle in Hennepin, Stearns, and Olmsted counties. Secondary migrants are refugees who were originally resettled in another state and then moved to Minnesota. This table shows the number of secondary migrants who reported their arrival to the Minnesota Department of Health. Hennepin and Kandiyohi counties received the largest numbers of reported secondary migrants, and Somalis were by far the largest group. Part 3. What are common experiences of refugees prior to resettlement? Previous learning modules have given socio-political and historical backgrounds of some of Minnesota's largest refugee populations, including Somalis, Karen, Bhutanese, and Iraqis. The next few slides present a framework that describes experiences that are common across refugee groups. The purpose of giving this information is to contextualize the experiences and potential vulnerabilities of new refugee families in resettlement. Scholars have described the impact of the refugee experience by referring to 3 stages that all affect refugees' adjustment in resettlement: what refugees experience pre-flight, flight, and in the refugee camps continue to impact them once they are resettled. Child welfare workers interact with refugee families in the final stage, which is resettlement. It is important to note that individual experiences are contextual and that the effects of these experiences depend on economic, social, and cultural conditions in each phase of the refugee experience, as well as individual characteristics. The pre-flight period refers to the experiences that refugees face in their home country in the time leading up to their decision to flee. The pre-flight period is characterized by political violence and oppression, which is used by governments to terrorize and intimidate individuals and society. Government-sponsored torture is a common experience of refugees. A 2005 meta-analysis by Porter and Haslam estimated that between 5 and 35% of refugees have endured torture. This number may be much higher in certain populations. In addition, a much greater percentage of refugees have survived war trauma experiences. A number of studies have documented high prevalence of loss and separation of family members in the pre-flight period. Other experiences that can occur in the pre-flight period include physical and sexual violence, witnessing death, detention, forced labor, economic deprivation, food shortage, illness and malnutrition, and curtailment of rights, such as freedom of expression, freedom to assemble, and arbitrary arrests. All of these tactics are used by governments and groups in power to perpetuate fear and induce feelings of powerlessness. The period of flight is the experience of migration from the home country to the country of first asylum. Refugees often leave their home country with little preparation, on foot, by sea, or by other means, and with few provisions. Refugees may walk for weeks or months to get to safety. Flight from one's homeland represents a major life event. Refugees are also commonly separated from family members during this period. In addition, during the passage, refugees may experience extreme danger, and women may face particular vulnerabilities. A statement of a Mozambican refugee interviewed in 1991 describes this experience. Please take a moment to read this quote. The reception phase is the time a refugee spends living in limbo in a country of first asylum. After refugees have crossed an international border, they often seek shelter in a refugee camp or an urban area. They also often register with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, or UNHCR, who may provide some basic relief items. In this stage, refugees continue to face a lack of safety. Women are also vulnerable to sexual violence in this stage, especially if they must leave the refugee camp, for example, to collect firewood. Refugees, who often do not have documents to live legally in the country of asylum, also face a continued fear of deportation back to their home country. Refugee camp conditions are often characterized by poor sanitation, poor access to nutritious food, poor health care, and limited educational and employment opportunities. In addition, there are health consequences associated with prolonged asylum. The UNHCR defines a protracted refugee situation as one in which 25,000 or more refugees of the same nationality have been in exile for 5 years or longer in any given asylum country. Currently, 2/3 of refugees have lived in protracted refugee situations. Finally, because refugees are unable to leave the camp or work legally in an area, they are forced to be dependent on outside aid to meet their basic needs. To the extent that refugees are excluded from decision-making that affects their lives, this may also facilitate attitudes of learned helplessness, which may increase the likelihood of depression. This is a picture of a refugee camp in Rwanda that houses Congolese refugees. This is a picture of the Melaun refugee camp in Thailand that houses primarily ethnic Karen refugees from Burma. Some refugees have lived in this camp for 2 decades. Not all refugees have come from living in refugee camps. Some have lived in urban areas. This is a picture of a young Syrian refugee named Mahmoud. He lives in an urban area in an underground shelter in Lebanon, where he shares a tiny room with his parents and 8 siblings. This next section describes what supports are available to refugees when they arrive to the United States. The goal of the United States Refugee Program is that refugees will become economically self-sufficient as soon as possible after they arrive. All refugees are assigned to a voluntary agency who provides initial reception and placement services, or R&P services, which include pre-arrival preparations for new families. In Minnesota, there are 5 voluntary resettlement agencies, which are listed here. Refugees are also eligible for public services and public assistance upon their arrival. These are the core R&P services that voluntary agencies provide to all refugee families within their first 30 days of arrival. Some families may receive services from VOLEGs for up to 90 days after their arrival. Please take a moment to review this slide. All refugees are eligible for up to 8 months of refugee medical assistance after their arrival. They are also eligible for ongoing medical assistance or other health care based on their income. All medical care services that accept Medicaid, Medicare, or other federally funded program are required by Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act to provide interpreters. This particular issue will be addressed in greater depth in the second learning module in this series. There are approximately 15 agencies in Minnesota that are funded through the Minnesota Department of Human Services Refugee Programs Office, or RPO. Successful employment services are defined by the number of refugees who enter employment, remain employed for at least 90 days, reduce or terminate their reliance on cash assistance, and the number of refugees who enter full-time employment that offers health benefits. Refugees are eligible for employment services for up to 5 years, but priority is for new arrivals or people who have been in the United States for less than 1 year, and people who are receiving public assistance. Additional services are called Refugee Social Services and are also funded by the state RPO. Approximately 20 agencies, including some in out-metro areas, such as Rochester and St. Cloud, are contracted through RPO to provide these services. Services are outcome-based and are tracked by the number of refugees who are placed in subsidized or unsubsidized housing, who adjust their immigration status to legal permanent resident or naturalized citizen, and the number of families who are independently functioning. This is defined by the number of families who have reliable transportation, who participate in school or other organizational activities, who are enrolled in previous quarters and then provide transportation or translation to other families. Additional services for secondary migrants are also available. Again, refugees are eligible for refugee social services for up to 5 years after their arrival, but priority is again for people who have been in the United States for under 1 year. Re-enrollment eligibility for refugee social services is determined on a case-by-case basis. This would be, for example, if a refugee lost their initial housing and requested additional assistance in this area. Additional refugee social services may be available in an area depending on discretionary funding. These services include services to older adults, support from ethnic community-based organizations, services for survivors of torture, micro-enterprise development, and individual development accounts. These services are generally time-limited and not available in all areas. Even with the resettlement services described here, refugees may face many resettlement challenges. One study has suggested that the heavy emphasis on early employment and employment-related activities may prevent agencies from having the time and resources to address mental health symptoms, though these symptoms may affect employment and resettlement outcomes. One service provider shared a similar feeling, describing, "We do not assess for mental health issues. Our job is case management." What is important for child welfare workers to note is that refugees may have received all available refugee resettlement services, and still have unaddressed mental health needs, as well as other needs related to resettlement stress. Part 4. What are common resettlement stressors? Resettlement stressors that refugees experience are ongoing daily life stressors that threaten psychological well-being and impact refugees' successful adjustment and resettlement in the U.S. A longitudinal study by Pereira and colleagues that included a sample of 437 Somali and Oromo refugees found that the most frequently reported stressors in the U.S. were related to employment, housing, and adjustment. Refugees face many additional challenges in the context of resettlement to Western countries. An emerging body of studies have suggested that post-migration living difficulties may have an even greater effect on mental health outcomes than pre-migration traumas. One Karen refugee described, "Some people still get stressed here in the U.S. Even though you get freedoms, but daily life issues are stressful. Some of them want to go back to the homeland." Refugees who are facing difficulties in resettlement may be dealing with ongoing physical and psychological effects of refugee trauma. One service provider described family stress as related to previous traumatic experiences in this way. Overall, many refugees are stressed, with high levels of anxiety. Some were tortured and raped back in the refugee camps, so there is so much to do with them. There is stress in families. Refugees may suffer from physical injuries due to dangers in the flight, camp, torture, or ethnic violence. This could include back and neck pain, eye problems, head injuries or head traumas, headaches and stomach problems due to beatings, seizure disorders, sexual pain and dysfunction, injuries or amputations, chronic pain, including all over body pain, and HIV and other diseases. Examples of mental health symptoms that refugees may be experiencing as a result of refugee trauma or resettlement stress include post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, problems with sleep, and difficulty concentrating. These symptoms can interfere with a person's ability to obtain or sustain employment, learn a language, as well as overall healthy adjustment and functioning. Child welfare workers who identify these symptoms in a refugee family with whom they are working should consider making a mental health referral. Making successful referrals of refugees for mental health services is the topic of the next learning module in this series. Although employment is the main goal of resettlement services, many people experience difficulty with employment. People who lack education, English language skills, and work histories are limited to temporary or low-skilled jobs. People who come with previous education or work experience may also face challenges in finding employment in their area due to language or because their degrees and credentials do not transfer. One service provider described, "People are generally frustrated as they perceive they were doing better in the camp as they were using their skills, for example, teaching or sewing, etc. Now in America, they are jobless, and welfare services are ended prematurely, leaving them no source of survival." Please take a moment to read this quote by a refugee service provider. Sometimes, family members have to travel to other parts of the state to find employment in meatpacking plants, and are separated from their families. A Karen refugee shared, "Husbands work in meatpacking factories far from home and can't help the rest of the family. He might get injured at the factory. Mental health symptoms and not sleeping are connected to worry that if the husband can't work, they won't get public assistance to pay rent." As these quotes illustrate, employment challenges contribute to other stressors, including financial stress, housing, and being able to afford other basic necessities. Financial stress is closely related to unemployment and poverty. Families who are unemployed, underemployed, or receiving public assistance may worry about having enough money to pay monthly bills. Another potential source of financial stress is repayment of refugees' travel loan. Refugees are required to repay the price of their plane ticket to come to the U.S., which is called a travel loan. This means that a larger family may have $10,000 in debt already upon arriving to the U.S., which they must begin repaying only a few months after their arrival. A systematic research review by Fazell and colleagues found that children's psychological functioning, self-esteem, and depressive symptoms are related to economic circumstances and parental worries about financial problems. One service provider described the challenges unemployed refugee families face, stating, "Welfare right now isn't enough to pay their rent, so they are extremely struggling." There is a general lack of affordable housing, and it is especially difficult to find housing for larger refugee families. Due to unemployment, low wages, and a lack of affordable housing, refugees may be forced to live in overcrowded apartments. In addition, the conditions in the apartments that they can afford may be poor. Without English language abilities, they may not be able to advocate for housing repairs. One service provider described, "They are living in apartments that are rat and cockroach infested. We are unable to complain about substandard housing conditions because of fear that they will be kicked out of the apartments for having too many people and then become homeless." Apartments that low-income families can afford are often in unsafe neighborhoods where refugees face physical assaults and muggings. One Bhutanese refugee described his experiences in this way. "Here I don't feel safe because of what happened in Minneapolis, where a few people and relatives were looted by some young guys and some cell phones were taken. Once when I was coming back from ESL classes, there was a kind of gang fight between two people. Luckily nothing happened. A few days ago, I was sitting in a bus stop on the way home. Two guys on a bike came and hit me. I feel strongly that we are new to this country. We are helpless. I don't have a cell phone to call the police." The process of acculturation is usually a slower and ongoing process that includes adapting to a new environment, such as learning a new language and learning cultural mores. Acculturative stress also includes stress that occurs within a family when different generations adapt at different rates, which can cause intergenerational conflict. Role reversal may result when children adapt to their new environment faster, taking on new responsibilities, such as translating or interpreting important family information. One study of 447 Southeast Asian refugees found that acculturative stress in resettlement was a stronger predictor of mental health than pre-migration trauma. Acculturative stress can continue to affect families for many years after their arrival to the U.S. Another source of acculturative stress is differing norms for appropriate parenting between a refugee's home country and the U.S. Refugees may not understand U.S. laws related to discipline and child rearing, and refugee parents may face a great deal of stress related to lack of knowledge in this area. One Bhutanese refugee described the acculturative process of a Bhutanese family. He has to maintain the family, maintain the house, pay the bills, pay the rent, bring food back, help to put his brothers to school. So there were a lot of refugees with a lot of responsibilities on their shoulders. I was surprised when he said he was only 20 years old, because this guy, he is the breadwinner of the family. Lack of English language skills can create ongoing challenges for refugees in multiple areas, including in their ability to access health and welfare services. One refugee service provider described, "Most refugee families are unable to navigate the social service system. They can't even open their mail and read it. So how can they sign up for various programs?" Similarly, a Karen refugee shared, "Most of the people who came to the United States, most of them are uneducated, so that this country has a lot of paperwork. Yes, so they have no education. It is very difficult to do the paperwork." A recent study done with Karen refugees found that people had ongoing needs for assistance with filling out paperwork and interpreting well beyond their first year of resettlement. Refugees may be experiencing social isolation and loss of social support as a result of the death of family members from violence or separation from family members due to violence and resettlement. They may need help identifying and accessing additional services that may be available to them, especially if they are no longer able to rely on the support systems that they have traditionally used. A 2010 study by Nickerson and colleagues that interviewed 315 refugees from Iraq found that participants who had immediate family members who were still living in Iraq reported higher levels of PTSD, depression, and greater mental health disability than participants without family members living in Iraq. This is relevant to several refugee populations in Minnesota who come from countries where there is ongoing war and conflict, and may have family members who still live in dangerous conditions. Some of these populations include Iraqis, Karen, Karenni, and Chin, and other refugees from Burma, Somalis, Oromo people from Ethiopia, Congolese, and others. Finally, a systematic review of research articles by Fazell and colleagues found that perceptions of acceptance or discrimination by refugee children resettled to high-income countries are highly relevant and are linked to outcomes such as self-esteem, adaptation, and depression. Secondary migrants are refugees who move from their initial placement site to Minnesota. These families are especially vulnerable because there was no planning for their arrival, as there was for their primary arrival. These families may stay temporarily with friends, relatives, or in a homeless shelter until they meet the 30-day residency requirement, which is required in order to receive public assistance in the state of Minnesota, or until they can find a job. Recall from earlier slides that reported secondary arrivals in Minnesota are largely Somalis. Part 6. What are protective factors? Research indicates that a number of personal and social factors modulate the risk for maladjustment and mental ill health. These include the presence of an intact family, material resources, social support, belief in one's ability to cope, religious affiliation, and maintaining a sense of one's cultural identity. These are factors that may protect against the stress of sociocultural adjustment. The resettlement stressors identified in this presentation impact long-term health and mental health success or vulnerability of refugees in resettlement. Overall, stable settlement, including minimization of relocation and adequate social and material supports, are areas where child welfare workers may intervene to impact the health, well-being, and functioning of a refugee family. It is important to remember that the majority of refugees will survive substantial life challenges without developing a psychological disorder. The quote on this slide represents an important reminder to social service folks who tend to see refugee families only when they are significantly struggling. It reads, "Refugees present perhaps the maximum example of the human capacity to survive despite the greatest of losses and assaults on human identity and dignity." It may be important for child welfare workers to remind refugee families that they have overcome significant challenges and that, with the appropriate supports, they can continue to overcome challenges in their new environment. Being able to provide culturally appropriate services to refugee families involves having a basic knowledge of the common experiences, strengths, and challenges that people from these communities have faced. These are 3 excellent resources for child welfare workers. Please take a few minutes to review the type of information that is available from each of these websites. You may also want to write them down so that you can access them in the future. This reference list provides a number of important studies in areas of refugee resettlement, mental health, resettlement stressors, and protective factors for refugees in resettlement. You can review these resources and learn more about any of these topics. This completes the learning module titled Understanding the Resettlement Context, Vulnerabilities and Resettlement Supports for Refugee Families.